Speaker in this session is Damien Farrelly. So Damien is the recently appointed CEO of the Fresh Produce Safety Centre for Australia and New Zealand. The Fresh Produce Safety Centre's role is to collaborate with stakeholders and to create independent, science-driven food safety guidance for a safe, resilient and thriving fresh produce industry. So shifting our attention from seafood to fresh produce, please welcome Damien Farrelly.
Up to use that one. Yeah. Thank you, Scott. So I'm going to tackle one of the issues we talked about this morning from Shamwell's presentation. We talked about collaboration being in the hard basket. So I'm talking about unified approach to safer produce. I think this coordinate and cohesion that's needed is something really important in the fresh produce industry. I'm hoping I can help for that today. So I'm going to use Cyclone Gabrielle as our example of where food safety system maybe didn't respond as we would have liked it to, and talk about some of the challenges, some of the things we've already done, and maybe some of those questions that are yet to be answered. So a bit about the centre. Scott's already given a quick overview, but we are an independent not-for-profit, trans-Tasman, so Australia and New Zealand. We like to emphasise the and. Established back in 2014, and we have Captain Richardson here as one of our first directors, to really understand what are the science gaps in a fresh produce industry when it comes to food safety, but then also bridging that gap between science and implementation on farm. So great to have some of our founders in the room, and hopefully we're still on the right track 10 years later. We are funded by people across the produce industry, but primarily by retailers and industry, as well as regulators. And the New Zealand Food Safety Science Research Centre, of course. So our role is to create that independent science-based guidelines, and ultimately they have to be practical for growers to adopt on farm. And we want that co-benefit of safe produce, but also a thriving industry. If you don't have profitability, then we don't have safe produce either. We don't have any produce to be safe, I suppose. We do a lot in the leadership and facilitation space, so we might have our own project, or we might just support someone else to drive a project that is focused on either guidelines, research. We do a lot in the collaboration space, extension, and ultimately all about continuous improvement in food safety. We host some events like our symposium in July, which is in Sydney in 2026. And the main output was that the information is free for growers. We don't want to create any barriers for growers to access this information. So primarily free through guidelines, webinars, podcasts, and other types of resources. One of the main reasons the centre was set up was to be the custodians for guidelines and for fresh produce food safety, and to keep them updated. We're up to our 5th version now, which just launched a couple of weeks ago. I'll touch on that a little bit later. We are well connected across the fresh produce supply chain in Australia and New Zealand. You'll see hopefully everyone in this room is represented somewhere on that chart. We try to be as inclusive as possible, but we are genuinely connected to everyone in the supply chain, from input suppliers to growers themselves, of course, and the assurance programs that are auditing growers to food safety standards. The guidelines are kind of like the how-to meet food safety standards and regulations. So for us, it absolutely takes a village to ensure food safety outcomes. So all of these stakeholders have their part to play, which was mentioned earlier on as well. So we're kind of that conduit, I think, in between, that independent conduit across the supply chain and between all of these stakeholders. So why is food safety important in the fresh produce industry? Well, different to other food sources, there's a lack of kill step in the fresh produce supply chain. It's not pasteurized, often not cooked. So we need to make sure that food is safe at the production level. So that means that food safety risks need to be managed on farm. We need to prevent contamination in the first place. So an example here, maybe an Australian cow rather than a New Zealand one, but keeping the risk out of the paddock so that we don't have that initial contamination. Keep it clean was a key message from Jim Monaghan, who was the keynote speaker at our symposium last year. He's a professor in crop science at Harper Adams University in the UK, and very much re-emphasized that concept that if it's not contaminated in the first place, then you don't have to worry about decontamination later on. So keep it clean in the first place was a very simple yet effective message. Speaking of cyclones, this is not a cyclone photo, but it's from the Waikato in 2022, where a grower decided, an uncertified grower, I might add, decided to harvest some of their broccoli in their kayak, and maybe unaware of the risks that floodwaters can bring in terms of introducing food safety hazards. So the rest of my presentation very much around this theme, but on the bigger scale with Cyclone Gabrielle. So looking at some of the food safety trends when it comes to fresh produce, we have quite a lot of foodborne illness in the world, and in other countries, not so much in New Zealand. We're not sure if that's because of how it's been attributed, but in other countries, about 50% of those foodborne illnesses have been attributed to fresh produce. And then you've also got the business impact with recalls, and looking at Fazan's data saying that fresh produce is the third highest recalled category. So there's a business impact there, an economic impact from recalls, often that could have been avoided if we had better systems in place. Looking at the mega trends then, New Zealand Food Safety Science Research Centre did some work on this earlier this year, and some co-authors in the room, which looked at what are the big mega trends and what are the impacts that they're having on food safety. And some of the things that we're seeing is increased frequency and intensity of weather events, and floods and droughts been the two key ones. We'll talk about more of that later. And we also have resource depletion. And when you think about that from a grower's perspective, it's access to potable water. If there's less water, they're probably going to start looking at more risky sources of water, surface water for irrigation, and that's going to have an impact on food safety. We also have increased spread of animal and plant pathogens, and increased temperatures means pathogens are happy. Maybe if they're in where they are in that curve that we just saw in the seafood industry, it's similar for pathogens. And also we're seeing the proximity of animals to production, not as common in New Zealand, but in other countries certainly happening, and that's increasing risk. And then we also have increasing risks of mycotoxins, agrochemical residues, and what Audrey mentioned there, pathogens. And this was another impact in terms of climate change, is the breakdown of agrochemicals and how we're changing our production types. If we've got our crops growing under cover, well, then that's decreasing the UV, which is increasing the risk of residues. So, we might be having an intervention for some other reason, maybe for hail, maybe for some, maybe another option, but that's actually our pest control, and then that's having an impact on the chemical breakdown. So just thinking about Cyclone Gabrielle, initial response post-cyclone, we found that growers had access to existing guidance like Fresh Produce Safety Centre, and that was been shared with growers and industry. I would like to have seen it been shared a bit more, but it was shared, and that's a good sign initially. Growers were directed not to harvest any produce that had been contaminated or potentially contaminated with flood water. So that was a pretty clear directive. We had growers and packers have been directed to segregate any high-risk products. So sometimes you had paddocks that were definitely not affected at all. And you had some paddocks that maybe part of the paddock was affected. So we're saying, well, that was high risk. We're just going to keep that separate just in case, and we'll just do an extra treatment step on it, even though it wasn't flooded. It just has that higher risk profile. We've seen a lot of support in the apple and kiwi fruit industry, which was great to see, and they were provided with a lot of extra guidance. They were really in peak harvest, so they had to get it right. So they had additional guidance, not just on the harvest component, but also on how to manage their equipment, and people, and what we might already mentioned there in segregation. They increased their monitoring levels, and they did a lot more cleaning and testing just to verify that things were good. We also had a big increase in inspection level just to check for evidence of contamination. Maybe staff decided, we'll just pick this, it looks all right, but then maybe it wasn't. So we just just to give that extra bit of assurance from a market perspective, we've seen retailers doing increased inspections, but also those in the supply chain, just to be sure that no potentially contaminated product was being harvested. And silt's been a really obvious sign that something was not right. New Zealand Food Safety also developed some guidance for harvested product, and that was really helpful at the time. Probably reflection from me is just we were developing guidance in the middle of the crisis, so certainly a lesson learned there. Yeah, but it's still really useful to have that guidance that came out at the time. And the public were also given some advice. Please don't eat the food that you're finding in the street. And these are the people who were considering that, but I know we're in times of crisis, economic and otherwise. So understanding that food is not safe, similar to the kayak situation earlier on, there are things that you need to be considering. It's not just that it looks okay. So how do we go managing the food safety risk? Well, as far as I'm aware, there were no food safety outbreaks that are attributed to fresh produce and post-cyclone. So it's a really good outcome. I was one of the people that was very, very nervous at the time of the cyclone and seeing some of the things I was seeing and hearing some of the things I was hearing. So really good outcome overall. So I think that's demonstrates that the food safety system, while it felt a bit chaotic, it did respond effectively. So that's good news. We're good in a crisis in some ways. What were the initial lessons learned then? Well, we found that the hort industry had a fragmented approach to the response and communications. That's less than ideal. I spent a lot of time on the phone, and I just found that if I just had 10 people in the room, we would have been a lot more effective than many phone calls just to try and get that same outcome. And we've heard that from regulators as well. They're saying it was difficult to communicate with the hort sector compared to other sectors. So certainly a lesson learned there. Found that there was numerous gaps in guidance when it came to food safety, and that's why New Zealand Food Safety had to develop that additional guidance. So that's not ideal. On the plus side, we found that organisations that had a well-established food safety culture were much better prepared. So that is the best insurance policy against a food safety incident, and similar to what Matthew was saying in terms of crisis response, we need to have good food safety culture in order to achieve that. And this work came from Apples and Pears, who commissioned Plant and Food to do some analysis on the post-cyclone when dust had settled a little bit. How could we have done better? Found that a thorough risk assessment is needed pretty much immediately to inform the course of action. And again, we saw that in Matthew's presentation as well. You need to have people who are trained appropriately when it comes to sampling and testing. You can spend lots of money on testing, but if the sample is contaminated, well, then you're going to get bad results. And that was coming through at the start as well, where felt that we were getting test results but couldn't rely on them because of the sampling regime. So training seen as very important, but I suppose ultimately using people who are trained in the first place. Information gaps then, risk assessment for produce that's not ready for harvest. So you can't harvest the product can't harvest product that's been flooded, but then what about product that isn't going to be harvested for another month, 2 months, 3 months? We didn't have a risk assessment for that. Also support for decisions on when it can replant the flooded soils. An example here of carrots have been grown in the sediment quite effectively, but how long after the event can you replant, and when is it safe to do so? Again, not good decision support on that at the time. The guidance that even Fresh Produce Safety Centre develops is generic across the sector, and as was New Zealand Food Safety's guidance, but kiwi fruit is different to carrots. So how can you apply that general guidance, and do we have cross-specific guidance? That was certainly missing. What treatments can and should be applied post-harvest? So some products can be cleaned and maybe should be, some others can't and should not be. So again, it's pretty cross-specific and situation as well, whether you could apply that or not. What buffer zones you should apply from the floodwater around and above. There was lots of different things that came through, but that was been developed on the fly. Again, some really good work from people in the room here to get those buffer zones and to try and do a risk assessment on it. But again, not the time to be doing it in the middle of the crisis. And that linked to splashing. So how far from the flooded area or above the water could the trees be impacted? And then what do you do with the product that's not suitable for consumption? Do you mulch it? Do you mow it back in? Do you harvest it and turn it into compost? What do you do with it? And again, we saw a range of things happening there. On the good side, there was a complaint that came through to New Zealand Food Safety about someone that was harvesting, and it was seen as, oh, they're harvesting, but what they were doing was getting the crop off the field because they didn't want it rotting. So it was good practice overall, and I suppose good that consumers felt the need to create that, to make that complaint. Other challenges then, more at the holistic level, mentioned already about that fragmented approach, but also it was a bit inconsistent depending on the sector that you're in. Apples and kiwi fruit, I think, did a really good job, and in other areas maybe not as well. And that led to a kind of imbalanced approach. It felt like if you were in those sectors, you might be okay, even though they were most impacted. They were also seemed to respond the best. And then people didn't know where to go for information. So it's like, oh, we don't have any information. Here's a guideline from the Fresh Produce Safety Centre. Oh, no, we'll go and develop another one. So there was that kind of lack of knowledge around where to go. And then roles and responsibilities, who's doing what, who's speaking to the media, who's developing the guidelines, who's talking to growers. That was lacking at the time. So we think we can do better. And at the time, I was at NZGAP Port NZ, worked with United Fresh as well on, we were kind of in the middle of a lot of the phone calls and said, well, we definitely can do better. What we're going to do. So over the last couple of years, we've been developing this model for improved collaboration, and more recently, Fresh Produce Safety Centre, New Zealand Food Safety Science Research Centre, and New Zealand Food Safety have got on board, which is great. So what does it look like? First of all, we kind of documented what does the New Zealand food safety system look like for horticulture, and there are a lot of stakeholders on this diagram. But in the middle, you'll probably see that you've got something like a cyclone. We've got a problem. Usually that means that we have to do some research, develop some guidelines, implement those guidelines on farm. Then we're going to audit, verify that they have been implemented as expected, and then we'll monitor our performance. That's kind of the continuous improvement cycle for food safety. And we tried to apply this across the board for all the food safety issues. But what it requires then is collaboration between everyone within the network, because there are different organizations that are responsible for different parts of the system. We're looking at establishing a network then based on that framework. And the idea is to get those industry leaders in the room, facilitate better communication and more effective, I suppose, when it comes to food safety, prepare for the next crisis more effectively. How can we mitigate the impact of those large-scale events and improve the access to information and harmonize how we approach improvement in the food safety space, so that all of those elements are, if you're doing science, then you can push ahead and do science. If you're in the regulatory space, you understand the policy settings that are required in order to enable the food safety system to operate effectively. So the idea is to harmonize that approach more effectively, get better strategic alignment. If we're going to solve some of the wicked problems, whether it's residue or pathogens or it's crisis response, we need to have that strategic alignment across all these organizations. So how are we going to achieve that? And then also mitigate against potential emerging risks. It's kind of an idea of what it might look like with some existing organizations that are existing groups rather than individual organizations. If you have the network in the middle, I feel like it would feed into the food and beverage forum because it's across the whole food industry, and crisis management teams, which we'll get into in a minute. But in the hort space, we've got ERIS, we've got the Horticulture Task Force, we've got Food Safety Community of Practice, and we've also got technical working groups in the GAP space. I think these are all existing working groups that maybe aren't working with each other and also don't have a central place to kind of say, well, how does this elevate up into improving the food safety system overall? So I think just coordinating these groups a little better, giving them better sense of purpose in some ways. We might have to look at roles and responsibilities a little bit, but I think ultimately it's about improving the communication flows, improving the collaboration between all of these existing groups, and maybe there should be more groups if there are gaps. Where's if the Hort Task Force goes around science, then where's the task force that's looking at policy, for example? So I've covered this a fair bit already, so I won't dwell on that too much, but I think ultimately we're looking at, if we're going to say an overall goal is to be better prepared for future critical incidents, well, then we need to be strategically aligned in order to achieve that common goal. And then what are the activities that each of the organizations is going to be doing in order to achieve that goal? We can check in each other, hold each other accountable, that kind of thing. But ultimately, we want to have shared goals and attain that strategic and operational alignment to achieve the goals. Something the Fresh Produce Safety Centre has been doing is developing better guidelines, and we just launched guidelines a couple of weeks ago, as I mentioned. So these are fundamental guidelines for fresh produce food safety, a pretty comprehensive document, over 200 pages. So for growers who are short of time, we've also developed quick guides, which is one page per chapter. So that's something that they would use more likely day to day. And very relevant for the conversations we've been having today is we've got new chapters on food safety culture and managing critical incidents and recalls. So please do have a look if you're interested. So that's some of the good stuff that's already been happening. In terms of incident management, Matthew's touched on this quite a bit already, but we have got this section on critical incident, which is grower focused, looking at if they had an incident, what would they do? So they've got different levels in terms of if it's contained, it's a simple one, maybe it's limited to the business. We've got uncontained, we're not sure what's happening, we need to look a little bit further. And we've got critical incident, which is, you know, widespread issue, probably going to lead to some sort of an outbreak or something like the cyclone, as we mentioned. So trying to help have a risk-based approach to managing critical incidents. And again, something that's been very proud of in the new guidelines. And thank you to Matthew for leading the working group on that chapter development. So then thinking about critical incidents on a macro level, then you've got the growers incident management plan in the middle. You've got SIMS on the left from MPI, their incident management system. Civil Defence also were very involved in the likes of the cyclone with their emergency response. Afterwards, I think local groups were set up, like the Horticulture Action Group in Hawke's Bay. We've got Pukekohe Vegetable Growers Association as an example there. There are loads of locally focused groups that are also horticulture based. But again, it probably happened after the fact. And they're looking at developing incident management plans at a collective level. So it's very regional based and to deal with things like cyclones. But then something we're probably missing at the moment still is the industry level incident management plan. So you could have an incident in kiwi fruit, well, they would manage that, or in apples, they would manage that. But when it comes to something like a cyclone, we don't have a collective incident management plan for the sector. So that's something that we need to look into. And to finish up, we do also need to improve our food safety awareness and comms, looking at our broccoli guy again. Something that was reported and stuff is it is believed that broccoli should be okay in the water as long as it's getting plenty of sunlight. So there's your food safety asterisks for today. So yeah, certainly a lot of work to be done to improve the awareness across consumers. People know, most consumers know not to eat unpasteurized milk or raw chicken, but maybe not flooded produce. So we've got some work to do. I've flicked through next steps. So we're socializing this concept of the networking collaboration at the moment. So very much interested in your feedback. So please come have a chat with me today or afterwards. We want to collate that and build a really effective network based on that feedback. We want to ensure food safety is on the line in those incident management plans at a sector level, because again, we are looking at the economic components and the people components and that, but we want to make sure that food safety is a component as well. We're raising awareness about the guidelines, getting those out to growers, and we want to fill those research gaps and develop more guidelines that I mentioned earlier on, and ultimately we want to collaborate more effectively. So I just want to finish by acknowledging the groups that have helped get us to this stage, and also the individuals in the room that have helped, like Livy and Matthew and Felicity and where's Phil. So, you know, really good stuff to get us to this stage in terms of the network, but also the guidelines were developed, and that those guidelines were developed through a Horticulture Food Safety Initiative project that we've got, which is funding from lots of people across Australia and New Zealand that were in that diagram earlier on. So huge thank you to everyone for making this possible. Thank you.